Hi folks, Dr. Biittner here and welcome to Anthropology 320. I'm really excited that you're going to be joining me for this course this term. And so this first video, I'm going to address some of the questions you might have around how this hybrid course is going to offer, and then we're going to jump right into some content. So hopefully it won't be too long. So just a quick note, whenever I provide you lecture notes, they'll always have a PowerPoint, they'll always be in PowerPoint format and they'll always be open as PowerPoint. And I actually recommend that you don't watch them this way in presenter view, but instead what you do is, oh, there we go. Look at them this way, either in normal view where you can pull up and look at the notes at the bottom, or if you go up into view and then click on notes page, that's another effective way, because you'll see in some of the PowerPoints I have additional speakers notes below. So these can be examples I use to illustrate points, or sometimes definitions of terms that are used, or just more explanation that I'm providing to you in oral format in these videos. So just as an FYI. But let's go back to our presenter view because it looks a little bit prettier for these videos. So I'm assuming, because this is a 300 level course, that you have all taken at least one university course before, and that course should be, and it's not even an assumption, is the prerequisite of Anthropology 206 or Introduction to Archaeology. So this course requires a minimum grade of C- in Anth 206 as a prerequisite. The other thing that might be useful for you to have, although if you don't have it, it's not a problem, is a course like Anth 110, which is Gender, Age, and Culture. But really, this topic, I'll be going over some of the basics that we would cover in that class, and we'll have a chance to revisit some of it. So don't stress out too much if you're only coming to this class with a background in archaeology. You're going to do just fine. But as I began with saying, and already we're off to a great start with me rambling all over the place, is that I'm assuming, because you have taken a course before, that you're already familiar with the purpose and function of the course syllabus or the course outline. So I'm not going to go over this in too much detail, but I did want to clarify a couple of key points. So you're already familiar with the course description, because that's what you see in the calendar when you're looking for and selecting courses. It gives you an idea of what we will be covering. I've also provided this comprehensive list of learning objectives or learning outcomes. These were designed by myself and other instructors in the department to reflect what we want students to take away at the end of this course. So all of the assessments I do, all of your assignments, in theory, are meant for you to provide you with an opportunity for you to illustrate what you've learned this term and whether or not you can achieve these various learning outcomes. This is what really needs to be addressed, though, is course delivery. So I mentioned this in my first email to you. We can talk about it in Collaborate a little bit this week as well. But for the first 6 weeks of the course, basically from now until reading week, we're going to be doing this class asynchronously. So what this means is I will post lecture notes as PowerPoints for you. Again, I ask that you review those. Then I'll have these lecture videos. These will be between 15 to 30 minutes in length. I try to keep them as short as possible, but sometimes I do get a little excited and rambly, as those of you who've had me before know, guilty as charged. Then there'll be assigned readings as well. Now, again, this is a very reading heavy course, but you'll notice that the majority of the reading happens in this first half of the course. Now, and I'll talk about the readings a little bit more and the purpose and function of them, but I don't want you stressing out about them too much. Okay. We'll talk about the readings again in a moment, and we can go over them on Blackboard. So the idea, though, is that you'd read the lecture notes where I introduce some core concepts. You watch the video where I kind of illustrate some and highlight some key points from those lecture notes. And then you will read the assigned readings, which we will then talk about in our Collaborate sessions. So the whole point of us having a synchronous Collaborate session once a week is for us to talk about the materials, for me to answer any questions you have, for me to clarify any sort of content, stuff like that. From time to time, I may post additional videos or additional resources. There's a supplementary folder. All of that additional stuff, all that supplementary stuff is exactly that. It's not required for you to look at. Then after reading week, the goal is, fingers crossed, that we will do learning in person. And so starting the week of February 22nd, I'll be dividing you into two groups, a Tuesday group and a Thursday group, and then you will meet with me on campus. Now, how am I going to figure out which group you belong to? Well, there's a poll in the week one materials that I would like you to complete. You'll notice that it is a poll. It's not for marks. It's basically for me to get a feel for which class would you, or which day of the week you would prefer to attend class. Okay, and we can talk about this more again on discussion and collaborate. My goal is to hopefully assign you to whatever day works best for your schedule, but the reality is that not everyone is going to get their choices. So I'm hoping the poll will give me a really good understanding of what students' priorities are and the reasons are, and will allow me to do it in the most equitable way possible. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit more about what to expect in those in-person classes once we get closer to, because of course that schedule may change based on the current climate and what's going on health-wise. Okay, so I ask that you read through all of the course policies and expectations. It is your responsibility to be aware of what these are. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this video going over them. If you have any questions or concerns about them, please do let me know. But don't forget to do the syllabus quiz. So one of the ways that I'm evaluating whether or not students are actually reading this information is to assign a very low stakes syllabus quiz. It's only 10 questions. It'll take you a couple of minutes to complete. So just take care of that before the ad drop deadline on January 15th. Okay. So yeah, policies on late assignments are all in here. On recording and sharing materials are all here. Contacting me, same old, just don't forget that double T Biittner to get that correct. Something that is new for those of you who haven't had me in last term in an online forum is that what I do for office hours is I post a link every week. It's called Sign Up Genius. It's just an external scheduling site, and what you do is you sign up for slots. And the reason why I do that is to ensure that when you come to the Collaborate room to have office hours with me, that you're the only person there and we can talk about your work, your progress, etc., and have some assurance or sense of privacy and confidentiality. Okay, but if you have any questions about that, don't hesitate to contact me. Again, you're responsible for knowing and being aware of our policies and our expectations regarding academic integrity, but don't worry, I'll provide a lot of resources to you regarding citation, etc. and whatnot. But one thing I do want to clarify is that you need to be really cautious when using platforms, social media platforms, or servers, things like Discord, things that are external to the university, basically external to Blackboard, because you do put yourself at risk of something that's called improper collaboration, academic collaboration. Now, in this course, the majority of your work is all independent, and you'll see that when we talk about the assignments, which I'll be posting shortly on Blackboard for all of you to take a look at, and we'll talk about them in the Collaborate session as well. But it's still just important to note that you know, everything you're doing for this course, even though it's open book and at your own pacing, needs to be your own original work. Okay. And then I have some discussion ground rules. We'll talk about these in Collaborate as well, but basically these are, it's a living document, and I have these to hopefully create kind of a baseline of understanding, a launching point, because we all come from all these different backgrounds, from different education levels, from different knowledge of issues around things like gender, but also archaeology as well. And so these discussion ground rules are meant to create a productive, safe learning environment for all of us. So please review these, and we'll talk a little bit more about them. And actually some of them, you'll see how they reflect some of the specific concepts we're going to be talking about in this term, specifically relating to things like inequity, inequality, harassment, etc. Okay, and how that shaped our discipline. So I've given you a kind of a workflow. The schedule is on the syllabus, so I didn't copy it here, but every week you see what the topic is, you know what readings that you're expected to do, and so this flow just kind of summarizes what I already talked about in terms of what you should kind of be doing. And this class, because it is fairly reading heavy, particularly the first part of the course, I'm warning students to expect 10 to 12 hours of work a week, depending on the rate at which you read. Okay, so what about these assigned readings? I'm just going to pop this down a little bit. So there are 2 textbooks, but you'll notice they don't appear on the bookstore list. And the reason for this is that both Battle Baptiste Black Feminist Archaeology and Kaiser's Archaeology, Sexism, and Scandal are available for free through the library. So I've provided links to these books on the syllabus, and I'll also have links to them on Blackboard as well. Okay, but if you would like to buy a physical copy, you can, but it's not required, and I'll explain why. And it's because Battle Baptiste actually has a bit of background information that I'd like all students to read, so that we have a different perspective in terms of approaching gender in this course from an intersectional framework. And then Kaiser, as I don't expect everyone to read, but instead just be familiar with some of the core concepts that come out of it. And I basically have like a book review assignment that I'll have you do where you'll pick one of these 2 books to review. Okay. The majority of the readings you are going to be doing are PDFs, and so I upload them as PDFs to Blackboard, and they will appear in every week's folder. Okay, so that should be fairly straightforward. And again, I'll go over what Blackboard looks like and how to navigate it in our Collaborate session. Here's your grade determination. Keep in mind, however, though, that this is what we're going to start off with, but that doesn't necessarily mean with what we'll end with. I'll have some check-in points with you at various points in the term where we can decide whether or not some of these assignments might need to be axed based on what your workload is like. So one of the challenges with online learning is that kind of balance between ensuring that there's enough contact points between me and you that I can assess your performance in this course, but also not overloading you with all of these tiny little assignments that are kind of not meaningful or purposeful other than make work projects. So I'd say the only kind of make work project I have you do is the syllabus quiz. Sorry. But the rest of the assignments are, with the exception of one, which is the annotated bibliography or detailed book review, is meant to be what we call a scaffolded assignment structure. And so what this means is that all of your assignments will build into each other. And so you'll be constantly building upon work that you've done earlier in the term, leading towards your final project. And so even though your final project has a lot of weight behind it, it really does represent the accumulation of all the work you have. And you'll see that, for example, you'll be submitting a proposal fairly early in the term, but then later on in the term, you'll have a chance to submit a revised version of that proposal and get marks for that as well. So we'll talk a little bit this more in Collaborate, but I'm really excited about the structure. It's based on something I did in my 395 course last term, and students were really pleased and happy overall with how that course went. So I'm anticipating that you'll be very happy with this structure as well. And I tried to really divide it up in a fair way so that, again, you get a chance to get feedback from me before you're handing things back in, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. Again, most of you are familiar with me, but if you're not, I posted an introductory video to myself. I have a little bit of information here, and you'll hear a lot about my experiences in archaeology as we proceed through the term, because that's just how I happen to teach. It's at this point that I usually like to pivot into doing a land acknowledgement. We have a lot of formal language around land acknowledgements that we can use here at MacEwan. I tend to take a bit more of a personal approach and just explain that for me, the power of land acknowledgements comes from my own recognition that I'm a settler on Treaty 6 lands, that this is the traditional land and present home, ongoing continual home of many Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit populations. And I didn't know that. I grew up in the woods in Edmonton, here in Edmonton. I was told the story of Farmer Daly's apple fields, and that's why our school was called Daly Grove. What I wasn't told was that most of Mill Woods is on land that was supposed to be allocated towards the Papachaise Band as their reserve land. That never happened, clearly, because we have Mill Woods instead. And so for me, making a land acknowledgement becomes an important check-in point for reminding myself as to who I am, the biases I bring to teaching, to the privilege I have as a white settler on treaty territory, the privilege I have as a professor who gets to speak from a point of power and privilege. So all of these different things I just want you to be aware of shape my understanding, but I think it's really important that we remember where we are. and what our city is, and all the different ways that we construct meaning around it. And I also think that it's important to do this, especially as we are attempting to come together to create a learning environment when we're not always physically present in the same kinds of spaces. So while I'm sitting in my dining room / office / library in my apartment in Edmonton, in Southwest Edmonton, some of you aren't. You're in other places scattered throughout the province. And so I'm also looking forward to when we can come together on campus and create a community of learning, physically and safely present together again. And we'll talk a little bit more about place building, about places and spaces and anthropology, about landscape archaeology, all of these when we talk about engendering spaces later on. So the last kind of administrative point I want to make is this, which is that the most important thing that is going to determine the success of this course is you and the questions and the insights and the experiences that you bring, be it to our Collaborate sessions or to our in-person meetings. So don't hesitate to ask questions, especially about the readings. Some of the readings I've assigned, I'm going to admit, are challenging, okay? But I did that intentionally because we need to challenge ourselves as learners, as educators, in order to grow. And so I think it's really important for us to do that. And so just keep that in mind, that if you're not getting a reading, it's okay. You may not, I may not expect you to get a reading on first read. I want you to come with your questions, and we'll talk about them in our discussion sessions. So I've given you a little bit of a summary here for this first part. And so now would be a great chance for you to hydrate, take a little break, put the video on pause. And then when you come back, I'm going to get into some content that we'll also discuss in our Collaborate session this week to kind of, again, provide us all with a little basic background or some fundamental core ideas, again, concepts, there's that word again, that will allow us to move forward into this course. So cheers. Okay, don't forget to that syllabus quiz either. Oh, sorry, this is out of order. Why is place important? Well, we'll talk about this later on. So the second part of this video, what I want to do is, as I mentioned, review some basic concepts so we can get our brains back into thinking about archaeology mode. But I also wanted to introduce some concepts around gender and sex and some terminology that will allow us, again, to have a starting point to move forward. Okay, so just because I'm providing definitions for you now at this point in term doesn't mean that those definitions are going to remain the same or static throughout the term. That actually some of them we might want to interrogate a little bit more once we start to get into some more course concept. So the first thing I'd like you to do, and this is something you can do on your own before our Collaborate session, is to think about how we define archaeology, what archaeology is, what archaeologists do, and who archaeologists are. So you can use online material, textbooks you have, all these different things to come up with a definition, and we'll talk about these definitions in our Collaborate session. The second part of this activity is I'd like you also to think about some concepts from archaeology that you would like to revisit, so that I know what I need to go over again before or while we get into some topics, right? So we're going to be revisiting some concepts you've already been exposed to in Anth 206, but now we're going to be adding a gendered lens to them, an intersectional feminist framework actually to it. And so it's hard to do that if you're still struggling to understand the basics, right? So basically what I've done is provided you with a list of some terms that I thought would be useful for us to look at. Again, this idea of understanding what anthropology or archaeology is and where it fits within anthropology, remembering that this is an anthropology course. So even though the topic is archaeology, it's anthropological archaeology. And so that means we approach it very differently than people who are trained in archaeology in other ways may approach this topic as well. So I provided you with some summary, just to, again, refresh your memory of the various kinds of things that archaeologists can study, what we often call subfields or specialties in archaeology, noting that a lot of these variations are a result of differences of focus in time and or space that we may have as individuals. Then again, review some basic terminology, what material culture is. We're going to spend some time looking at lithics and ceramics later on in the term, how we can interpret labor, for example, and can we do this using a gender lens using material culture? We'll see features. We're going to have a bioarchaeology component, so we'll talk about human skeletal materials. And then we'll also talk about kind of, again, taking that anthropological perspective of a holistic perspective, is we also need to look at the physical environment as well, because it shapes, of course, cultural practices. So a site, refresh yourself with what a site is. We'll talk a little bit about scale. So that's another good important thing to look at. And of course, context. So those of you who've taken 206 with me know that I hammer context all the time into your brain because it is the most important concept in archaeology. It's the foundation of all of our interpretations. So if we're going to be attempting to understand something as complex as gender, we need to be critical then of the context of the data that we're basing our interpretations off of, right? So context really becomes super important. And I always want you thinking about that as you're reading the reading. Well, what is the context of the material that they're using to make these interpretations, right? What is the evidentiary standards that they're using? And we'll talk about some different methods we can use to critique various interpretations as well that go beyond just being like, oh, well, the context isn't clear, so clearly this interpretation is problematic. That's not always the case, by the way, either. Even when context isn't always clear, there's still really great interpretations that can be made. We just have to be critical then about some of the, again, challenges with that, right? Site formation processes are useful to consider, right? Cultural versus natural transformation processes, preservation. What else did I put in here? And then also a brief review of the major types of archaeology. And something that I wanted to highlight, which was why it's a little bit of a bolder text or a larger text on the slide here, is archaeology as the contemporary, because gender archaeology really, as you'll see in our first few readings, has only been around for about 40 years or so, which isn't that long of a time, really speaking, even though archaeology is a fairly young discipline, formally speaking, in terms of how it's been taught. It's for the last 40 years, since the 1980s, where gender first was kind of explicitly talked about in the literature as something that we needed to think about a little bit more, that we needed to consider how it was being utilized in terms of archaeological interpretations, in terms of how we were represented in the past. It really didn't take off, though, until the 90s and then the 2000s. So really, and you'll see that it still kind of is a field in development. So gender archaeology, or archaeology as a gender, really does kind of fall into other forms of archaeology as contemporary. And we'll talk about this too as well when we look at queer theory in a couple of weeks. So the last thing I want you to think about, and we'll talk about this and collaborate this week, is also thinking about how the kinds of archaeology we do is shaped by so many different kinds of factors, right? That the projects themselves have a context, right? That archaeologists have motivations that influence the kinds of archaeology we do, the questions we ask. Who we are as individuals shapes the interpretations we make, and so we'll talk about this last point of, well, what does gender have to do with it? Well, it turns out a lot. The gender of the archaeologists themselves. I mean, the fact that I am, a cis female shapes the kind of archaeology I do, but the fact that I am bi and polyamorous also kind of shapes who I am as a person, and then shapes kind of the things and questions I'm interested in, particularly around issues around, you can imagine, things like inequity and diversity and inclusivity and accessibility of archaeology. And so we're going to talk about all of these different kinds of ideas, but just kind of think about these questions, because we will revisit them when we also look at, well, how do these factors shape, who not only does archaeology, but who publishes on archaeology, who is disseminating information about archaeology. And we'll talk about, as I mentioned, this in an upcoming week. Okay, so once we've reviewed archaeology, the next major thing we need to do is talk about the other major concept in this course, which is gender. And so I'm hoping that most of you have taken at least one of our anthropology courses at an introductory level where gender was introduced to you from an anthropological perspective. And the approach that we're going to take in this course is by immediately dividing and distinguishing sex from gender. So when we refer to sex in this course, we're going to be talking about the observable physical differences between male, female, and intersex individuals. Okay, and so we're going to be talking about biological attributes, particularly those that are associated with human reproduction. And we're going to be a little bit critical of these as well, because which of these attributes are used is shaped by our culture. So even though we think of sex as something that's natural and biological and fixed, it turns out that it's not quite that way. Gender, on the other hand, deals with things like the ways that we're expected to behave and think and feel as members of a society, right? So it's not just how we behave, but as I mentioned, it's the thoughts, again, the ways of thinking that are appropriate, of feeling. It's the ideology, it's the behavior, and all these different things are learned about, are things that we learn. So it's important then to have this core distinction of kind of gender as something that is cultural, something that can be very individual and personalized, but has social meaning. It's something that's constructed in a social arena. And then we have sex, that also is something that is debated and critiqued and discussed in a social arena, but because it's linked with physical attributes and biological attributes, is often shaped as something much more natural than gender is. So on this next slide, again, you're going to have to zoom in a little bit more on your computers, but I wanted to show, again, the complexities of determining sex in an individual. And I can't remember the source of this. I'll have to find it. Unfortunately, I didn't copy it over when I downloaded this image. But what you see is that, you know, at the point of conception, there are two different factors that shape or determine our biological sex, right? So our chromosomes and our genes. Then between conception and birth, we have hormones that play a role. At birth, then we have internal and external genitalia or reproductive organs such as gonads that then play a factor. And then around puberty, we have the onset of secondary sexual characteristics. So sex is something that is not, well, we often assign it at birth, and it's often seen as established at birth. It actually isn't. It's something that we also biologically grow into as well and develop. And what I like about this is that this slide also then separates out gender and sexuality from sex, right? And so it says, like, these are all the different kind of variations that we can have in sex. And you can see it's not simply just male and female, but there's a whole bunch of different ways that sex can be composed and determined. And then we can now apply gender and sexuality on top of that, and you can see why things get very complicated very quickly. So the other way I like to then approach gender is through what I call my non-definition, that gender is not something that is stable. It changes over time, and we're going to look at that explicitly in this course. It's one of our major concepts. We're going to look at it in terms of how it's used to shape identity, both individual and group identity, but it's not something that can be objectively determined. There's the subjectivity or intersubjectivity that's present. We're going to look at all the different ways that gender is expressed and affected. We're going to look at, again, how context influences gender and whether or not we're even able to get at gender. And I also want to emphasize this, that it's not a matter of attempting to get at genders beyond the heteronormative male and female. It's not even really a question of how we define gender, but rather it's acknowledging that gender is important, right? And that there is quite a bit of variation in how gender is understood. So the rest of these slides, basically what I do is introduce a bunch of terminology too that is going to be used throughout the term, right? So terms like heteronormativity, the idea that there's only two genders and two sexes, which are also sexually attracted to each other, is referred to as heteronormativity. But heteronormativity is not a cross-cultural universal, that we see many other expressions of gender, of sex, and also of sexuality outside of the heteronormative dichotomy. And that's why I love this Genderbread person. And I should check to see if there's a new volume of it that's been put out, but shows again the complexity then of how this plays out in terms of who we see ourselves as a person. And this is why we can see gender also as a form of debate, right? Because we have our gender identity, we have our gender expression, we have our attraction, which can be romantic and sexual, or neither, or both, or one or the other. We have biological sex or anatomical sex. So we have all of these different concepts at play in terms of ourself. And so this then, in terms of how we choose to behave as a gendered individual, to express our gender, to acknowledge our gender, all the terminology we use, is something that we may debate as individuals, but also could be debated, in the public sphere as well. Okay. So what we have to remember then is that even though we are often assigned a sex and a gender at birth, we have to learn what those ideas mean, what our sex means, what our gender means, and what it means to be a person of those genders and sexes, which means that we are taught our gender, we learn our gender, we perform our gender, it's reinforced and it's enforced. It's some cases criminalized and regulated by institutions such as churches and states, right? So all of these different things then is why we refer to gender as being culturally constructed, right? And just because something's culturally constructed doesn't mean it's not important. It clearly is, right? And chances are, because you're taking this course, you already understand this idea and embrace this idea that gender is something that is constructed. And you're interested in learning more about that process. Again, some more additional terminology. So what do we mean when we talk about gender roles? And we're going to look at this later on when we look at labor and division of labor and subsistence. Gender ideologies. So we're going to look at, again, these ideas about what the differences are between us and actually what they mean and if they are meaningful, right? And that's when inequity comes into play. And we'll talk a little bit about this as well. Well, the whole topic on gender equality and inequality, equity, inequity, justice, all these concepts that come to us from contemporary intersectional feminism. So what then do we mean by archaeology of gender? Well, there's many different ways we can define it. We can define it as it was initially defined as the explicit inclusion of gender in the study of past societies. It began with some early challenges in the 60s and 70s, and we'll actually look at some of these early models and early challenges, man the hunter, woman the gatherer. But then in the 1980s is when we actually see a movement within archaeology to have this as a particular field of study in the 80s. And so that's why some of the first articles you're reading come to us from the 1980s. And then I outline some of the reasons why this is the case here, and we can talk about these a little bit more, and we'll see some of these next week as we go look at the history of archaeologies of gender, look at the history of gender in archaeology, of the methods that we've used to study it. But it turns out that, again, just simply calling it the explicit inclusion of gender in the study of past societies doesn't actually capture all of the different things that people do under a heading of gender archaeology or archaeology gender. And that's why I kind of call this archaeologies of gender, because we can also look at how archaeologists study gender. We can look at how archaeologists represent gender, and we're going to look at both, not just in terms of the literature, but also in terms of museums as well in this course. We're going to look at, as I just kind of briefly touched upon, the cultural construction of gender, but also critically sexuality as well, and how it can be really challenging to separate those two, and we don't often realize how just deeply embedded they are in our narratives when we start to talk about the past. Some focus explicitly on challenging, again, a heteronormative telling of the past. Others focus on, as I mentioned, inequity in the practice of archaeology. So again, who is doing archaeology, who is publishing archaeology, etc. But one of our core framing concepts is going to be the idea that we also have to understand that if we only focus on gender, we're missing out on the much larger picture, that what we want to do is recognize that there's other roles, activities, behaviors, and ways that we categorize people that become visible when we start to focus on gender that is equally as important in understanding life in the past and those people and their belief systems, but also in terms of understanding gender itself. And so we will refer to this using the term of intersectionality, and we're going to do a whole week on this topic where we look at the ways systems of power interconnect to affect individual lives and experiences, right? So we're not going to use gender then as a structuring principle before these other differences and categories, but rather we're just focusing in on it, and then we're going to see the various ways that these other differences, these other categories, these other roles come into play. And so that's why one of the key readings of this course is Black Feminist Archaeology by Dr. Battle Baptiste, because that's one way that we can, and a really important way that we can get at intersectionality in our interpretations in the past, which is by decentering white heteronormative narratives of our histories, of our past. So we have a whole bunch of problems, and we're going to address almost all of these in the class. And by address, I mean not solve. Address mean by interrogate and talk about. Okay, so we're going to look at how we engender archaeology in the past. We're going to look at how we can attempt to get at gender and find gender. We're going to look at some of the problems around using ethnographic analogy. We're going to look at how do we think with gender as a framing principle, but not, again, as a determining, structuring principle. Okay. And so for this, we have a couple of resources. And so we'll talk a little bit about this again in our Blackboard Collaborate session. We'll look at the work of Nelson. And I'll talk about how Nelson says that there's these kind of 4 main principles that we can use if we want to engender archaeology. And so first, we can root out essentialism or determinism, right? These kind of ideas that there is only one past, there's only one way of being, that gender is only defined in one way. So we got to kind of scrap all those notions and start from scratch. And we'll talk about how some of the earliest theorists in gender archaeology argue that the first thing we have to do before we end gender archaeology is de-gender archaeology. And we'll talk about what that looks like. We have to consider division of labor as a question, not as a given. So something we can attempt to get at, but something that isn't necessarily present. We're going to look at this third point in a week, not in a week, but in one of our weeks this term, where we're going to look at this question of the public versus private and the problems of this dichotomy as well, and how this has been very limiting in terms of understanding gender in the past. And we're also going to avoid homogenizing the men and women of a culture as well, right? That we're going to recognize that, not all women in a particular society perform the same roles, and not all men perform the same roles, and not all other gendered individuals, again, play the same roles within a society, right? And so we'll look at some examples of that. And this is where ethnographic analogy will prove actually to be quite useful, although in some other cases we'll see how it can be a bit more problematic. Okay. So what we should see is that there's a whole bunch of different strategies that we can use for gender archaeology or gender research, but they're not all created equally. And we're going to look at these a little bit more in detail next week. So I just want to introduce some of these terms for you, so review them, and then we'll get into them in week 2 when we talk about this. But of course, it's important to consider as well that, who we are as archaeologists often shapes the kinds of research we can do. It shapes who we have access to in communities. So we have to think about this. And one of the things we will be critical about around later on in the term as well is looking at how labor has been divided traditionally within archaeology, and why that is inherently sexist and why it's problematic, and how we have to change that, and how that will serve to both engender and degender archaeology at the same time in a beneficial way. And so we're going to look at several different types of evidence in order to engender the past. So the readings I've assigned you look at everything from spatial arrangements and households, and we have a reading about a hotel even, which is really neat, to artifacts. Well, of course, we'll do a bioarchaeology component. We're going to look at representations and depictions of people, both in terms of artistic representations done by people in the past, but also then representations of people in museums, etc., in artwork, in Nat Geo, etc. So basically, this was meant to introduce some of these core ideas for you in a very brief way, but just keep in mind that I'm introducing these ideas to you, and our challenge and our privilege for the rest of the term is to interrogate these concepts and to dig deeper into them, and to learn a little bit more about archaeology and gender. And then what I've provided for the last little bit of this PowerPoint is just some feedback, and I mentioned this at the beginning of this video, that I would do this regarding the readings and some approaches, right? Because you might be overwhelmed thinking, oh, there's 3 or 4 articles a week. How am I supposed to get through all of this? Well, the idea is that I'm not looking for depth of understanding, but rather breadth of understanding, right? Can you take away with some basic concepts from that article, right? And so that's what I've outlined here is what some of these main things I want you to walk away with, right? So is this a research report, or is this an overview? Is this a theory-based article, or is this about the archaeological record itself? Is it critiquing a method? What is going on here, right? So very summary sorts of points. What are the key concepts that are being presented? Who are they writing it for? What evidence are they using? All these different kinds of ideas. So I've provided you with this in the PowerPoint, but then I also provided a short form of this as well as a tips for reading document on Blackboard. So please do check that out. So I'll see you in Blackboard this week, and then next week we will get right into our readings and start to interrogate some of these topics. So take care and be well.